I was both surprised and sort of intrigued to see how much overlap there was between John's paper and my own when we got them in. We both were talking about the Weitzman-Nordhaus sort of debate. We were both talking about sort of betting on different theories and the questions it's raised. So fortunately, we swapped partly because John has laid the ground for part of what I'm sort of talking about here and outlined, that I can go quickly over some of the sorts of things that he talked about. So I'm discussing the Weitzman-Nordhaus exchange, following Weitzman's piece in the Review of Economics and Statistics in 2009, where Nordhaus criticized Weitzman for being alarmist, suggesting that Weitzman's sort of estimates of the possibility of really absolute catastrophe presupposes several things that would all have to happen, according to Nordhaus, for things to go so badly. You'd have to have drastic changes in the climate, you'd have to have severe economic or societal damages, and, Nordhaus argued, governments would either have, and society would either have to fail to recognize the danger, or they would have to fail to respond. And to get all of these things would have to happen to get the sort of disastrous outcome Nordhaus argued that Weitzman had been arguing for. He argued that, in fact, it was most unlikely that all of these would obtain, and consequently he argued that Weitzman was being alarmist. Weitzman's response, which I think John has already quoted part of here, is to say, well, actually, even if you think Nordhaus might be right or if I'm right, you ought to bet on me. And he gives an analogy. He says, suppose one person advises you that a fire insurance policy protecting your house against extreme losses is unnecessary because so few houses of your kind burn to the ground, while another person advises you that a complete fire insurance policy is necessary in your case. Other things being equal, should you flip a coin to decide what to do just because both advisors seem to be giving equally credible guidance? Now, whether he knew it or not, what Weitzman was doing was invoking Pascalian sort of reasoning here. Those of us who are familiar with the wager of Pascal know it runs more or less as follows. God may or may not exist. If you believe in God and go to heaven, your gains will be infinite. If you disbelieve, you will lose out on eternal life. It doesn't cost much to try to believe in God. Another premise that should be inserted here. Hence, it makes sense to try to believe, even if you don't know whether God exists. Now, one of the key things with the wager to note is that Pascal is not claiming that we have greater epistemic reason to believe in God. At one point, he seems to say, ex hypothesis, that the chances that God exists or don't exist are equal, that we can have equal credence in either atheism or God's existence. Similarly, in Weitzman's example, he assumed for the sake of the argument that you had equal epistemic reason to believe him or the other expert. However, for practical reasons of what to do in both cases, you have practical reason to act as if the more alarming prognosis is true. That's what Pascal argued. That's similar to what Weitzman is suggesting we should do in this case. Now, one of the things that was good about reading John's paper is I hadn't read Brian Hedden's paper up until this point where he introduces might. And I realized I'd read some other sort of literature of the same kind, but I realized that Hedden has actually formulated the kind of argument which I'm going to be drawing on here particularly well. And Hedden notes Hedden in his paper talks about a couple of kinds of uncertainty. He says we have to act under conditions of uncertainty. This uncertainty comes in at least two kinds. First, there is ignorance of descriptive facts. You might be ignorant of the potential causal impacts of the various actions available to you. For instance, you might be unsure whether to give the pills to your headache-suffering friend because you are uncertain whether they are painkillers or rat poison. Second, there is ignorance of normative facts, or facts about whether a kind of certain action or outcome is good or bad, permissible or impermissible, blameworthy or praiseworthy, etc. And sort of the recent work in moral philosophy that's focused on sort of wagering on moral theories and the sort of trying to maximize intertheoretic expectation that Hedden talks about have focused on sort of disagreement or ignorance or uncertainty about normative sorts of facts in terms of which moral theories we ought to subscribe to. Now, one of the things I want to sort of throw out here, and I'm interested in getting people's reactions to, is I think there are actually at least three kinds of uncertainty that are involved, and Hedden has sort of touching on two of them, but I think might want to speak in a more fine-grained kind of way. Let's take a normative question such as, should I give my young friend, a 13-year-old, 2 aspirins that you're trying to make a decision about? Now, it seems to me there are 3 kinds of uncertainty, at least, that might bear on such a decision. You might have uncertainty about specific facts. Are the pills that I have in my cupboard aspirin or rat poison, such as masks? Another one, though, is what I would refer to as positive theoretical uncertainty. How many aspirins, if any, are safe to give a 13-year-old? Does aspirin put 13-year-olds at risk of Ray's syndrome? These are not facts about don't depend on facts about my specific situation. They have to do with my sort of which theories about the effects of aspirin I ought to accept. A final sort of moral theoretical uncertainty one might be something like, is it my duty as a friend to give him my last aspirins, even though I may soon need to know that I may soon need them myself? Now, the literature like Hedden, Brian Lockhart, Jacob Ross, and others who have written on the question of moral uncertainty is focused on moral theoretical uncertainty. The funny thing is people spend a lot of time sort of arguing then about whether it's possible to make find a common currency among moral theories, whether it's really possible to do this. And they often sort of seem to suggest, well, that the focus has been on that. Whereas it seems to me as if an equally interesting question, one that is coming up probably with Weitzman's question, is what I'm referring to as positive theoretical uncertainty. What kinds of theories, not moral theories, but positive theories about the world ought we to accept? Let's take another example, the house insurance question here. The normative question then is, should I take out additional insurance for my house? The kind of question that I might be concerned with would again be uncertainty about specific facts. Is my house's wiring safe? Does my young son know where the matches are? Even if all my theories about when houses burn down are correct, and I nevertheless might think I need to take out insurance because I'm ignorant of these particular specific things in my situation. But then I might also have a broader positive theoretical question. How much more likely does a thatched roof make a house to burn down? That's not specific to my situation. It's a broader sort of question about our theories about when houses burn down. Finally, I should have said moral theoretical uncertainty here. Ought I as a parent be highly risk averse? That would be a question of then sort of doubts about which moral theory of my duties I ought to accept. Finally, let's consider the question of climate change. The normative question here might be something like, how much effort ought we to put into mitigating climate change and how soon? Now again, with Nordhaus's question, part of this depends about facts about the world, just sort of specific facts about the situation which we can't know in advance, such as, will the government recognize feedback effects in time? Will it take prompt and vigorous action if it does recognize feedback effects in time? This is part of what's at stake between Nordhaus and Weitzman. We don't know, and we might think for those reasons we ought to take out insurance by a more active sort of policy. But another sort of question would be about positive theoretical uncertainty. How sensitive is the climate system to increases in greenhouse gases? This may depend on which theories about climate change we think we ought to accept. And then finally, there would be again the question of moral uncertainty. For one example of that would be, how much ought we to discount future costs and benefits? That's a case where different moral theories offer competing sorts of answers. Now, Hedden's might, is stated as, when we take the expected moral value of an action on each moral theory, weighted by the probability that the theory is true, and sum them up, we get an intertheoretical notion, which we can call the intertheoretic expectation, or what he refers to as maximized intertheoretic expectation, or might. Now, Hedden and his colleagues seem to find this interesting in the area of trying to average across or sum up, moral theories and value of different moral theories, waiting for the amount that we subjectively believe we ought to accept them. I'm proposing that we also ought to be doing this with positive theories in various areas, in science, in the social sciences, and so forth. And it seems to me that this is less problematic than doing it with moral theories. With moral theories, we've got to worry about these problems of whether we have a common currency between moral theories and we can average across them. But if we're trying to do, if we actually agree on our sort of moral goals, it seems with the positive theories, then that this is a less problematic sort of process. Did you want to ask?
Well, I just want to make a comment that lots of people do that, in fact.
Well,
like in forecasting, there's a famous paper by Clive Granger in economics showing that averaging over different theories, different ways of predicting the future, can improve your prediction. And there's a whole literature on forecast combinations that's exactly this.
I'm going to want to talk to you about this. My key purpose in bringing this paper to this conference is I had this sneaking suspicion that there might be this whole literature on this question out there. It seems like a fairly obvious sort of thing to do, but I couldn't find any references to it.
It's related, by the way, to Scott Page's work on diversity, arguing that diversity is good because when you have more diverse opinions in a group, you average over views that are orthogonal to each other, and then so he's actually tapped into that theory recently as well.
Okay, well, I want to talk to you about this then. Now, so it's possible the rest of this lecture then is going to end up to reinventing the wheel. And if so, tell me at the end. I've just tried to do it in a kind of naive kind of way. But I haven't found references to this up to this point, and I don't think nor do, say, Weitzman refers to anything like this when he does this. So let's take the fire insurance. What I'm suggesting then is let's take the fire insurance analogy. Suppose you've got your two advisors. The first guy tells you that your house has a 1 in 10,000 chance of burning down next year. The second tells you that the chance is 1 in 1,000. And let's assume that you value the compensation from the more generous policy against catastrophe insurance that you're taking out. You would value it at $500,000 if your house burnt down. And let's suppose adding that catastrophe insurance costs you $200 a year. And finally, let's assume that you estimate a 60% chance that the first advisor is right and a 40% chance that the second advisor is right about the probability of your house burning down. What I'm suggesting here, and again, maybe this is just this very sort of crude way of doing it, but there might be more sophisticated ones, I don't know. Let's assume a 60% chance that the first advisor is right. You've got one chance in 10,000 that the house will burn down next year. And the total benefit from taking out the policy if the house does burn down is the cost, the $500,000 minus the cost of the insurance, the $200 that you'll spend. Suppose the second advisor then is right. You've got, in that case, a 40%, you attach a subjective probability of 40% to that person being right. You think there's a 1 chance in 1,000 that the house will burn down. And again, the total benefit if the house does burn down and the insurance pays out will be almost $500,000. Now, it looks to me, if you do the math then, that it seems to me we take we multiply the probability that the advisor is right by then the expected utility, if he is right, of taking out the insurance. We do it the same with the second advisor, and we sum it. And we get a sum value here, expected value of $229.91. Since this exceeds the $200 cost of the insurance, we get the conclusion that in fact we ought to take out fire insurance. Similarly, with runaway climate change, let's assume that 10 degrees or more of climate change will impoverish the planet and permanently reduce the population to 1 billion. I don't know if that's right, but for the sake of the argument, let's assume something like this happens. Let's assume that human beings would survive another 100,000 years after that, and there would be 3 generations per century. So this would add up to, assuming this impoverishes the planet for the rest of that 100,000 year history, would add up to the impoverishment of 3 trillion people over that period. And let's finally assume that Weitzman estimates a roughly 5% chance of 10 degrees more of warming. Now, Nordhaus's estimate is much lower than Weitzman of that sort of catastrophic warming. Let's assume it's 1/10 of 1%. Nordhaus has to grant that there's some chance this will occur, but he obviously thinks it's a lot lower. Finally, let's assume that we believe Nordhaus is probably right. Let's assume that an 80% chance that Nordhaus is right and a 20% chance that Weitzman is. Let's then calculate the value of taking out the kind of more climate insurance policy that Nordhaus is advocating. We have a postulated probability of climate change on a scale that would impoverish the planet in this way of 5%. The number of impoverished if it should occur would be 3 trillion. And we have a subjective probability that Weitzman is right of 20%. With Nordhaus, we have a probability of impoverishment of 1/10%. Again, the number impoverished would be 3 trillion, and we have a subjective probability of 80% that he's right. What's the expected value of ambitious action against climate change, the sort that Weitzman is advocating? Well, again, we do the math here, multiplying them by our subjective probability that Weitzman is right. We do the same for Nordhaus. And the sum value of taking action along Weitzman's line is preventing the expected impoverishment of about 30 billion lives, as I reckon it, which seems like a pretty damn good bargain in terms of, taking pretty strong kind of action. So this is the sort of normative way I'm suggesting we ought to be going about it. I think it's implicit in sort of Nordhaus's argument. Again, I'll be very interested then to hear about, to the extent to which how other people are already doing this sort of thing. I just want to wind up. I'm by training actually an international relations theorist, and I'm interested. And one of the things that strikes me in the social sciences, at least in political science, and sort of areas I work in political science, is that it's very common in terms of making policy making for political science to subscribe to what Ted Lockhart refers to as the my favorite theory approach. Political scientists, in making policy recommendations, commonly factor in specific factual uncertainty, but they don't tend to factor in theoretical or moral uncertainty. It's typical sort of line the way somebody like an international relations theorist will work is to try to establish what that person thinks is the most likely theory to be true, and then at your end of your article you write up the policy recommendations. Given that my theory is true, this would be the right thing to sort of do. So, for instance, take the debate over the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Kenneth Waltz, perhaps the best-known international relations theorist of the last quarter of the 20th century, famously argued that nuclear proliferation would probably be stabilizing around the world. It would make war a lot less likely. Rogue regimes that got nuclear weapons would know how to manage them competently, and that nuclear proliferation was, in general, a good thing. Now, I think Waltz's arguments are actually pretty damn convincing. I don't think they're convincing enough, but let's assume that you think Waltz is probably right about this. And let's assume, which I actually don't, that we think that states will always be able to manage nuclear weapons for all eternity without using them against each other. But now, you might think that's, even if you thought that was true, you're not going to think that with credence of 100%. You might think that's 80% likely to be true, or 60%, or something like that. Well, if you think Waltz is probably right that states will be able to manage nuclear weapons and the consequences will be good, you might nevertheless have some doubt in this question. And if Waltz is wrong and the nuclear pessimists about proliferation are correct, then the implications could be absolutely disastrous. Nuclear war. So the foregoing argument I've suggested is that even if you accept the arguments of the nuclear epistemically, the arguments of the nuclear optimists as being more convincing, nevertheless there's a case for opposing nuclear proliferation on the grounds that the consequences will be so bad if pessimists about nuclear proliferation are right. And consequently, I think we ought to bet on nuclear deterrence being unstable, even if we think the nuclear optimists are probably correct. And this is an illustration of the kind of argument I was suggesting here then has broad implications for policy recommendations within the social sciences, and are suggesting that social scientists should not necessarily take a my favorite theory approach, as they commonly do, when making recommendations for policy. I'll stop there.